Welcome and thank you for joining the PIM webinar. My name is Frank Place. I'm the director of the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets. This is our 8th webinar in 2018. Let me just remind you that you can find our previous webinars on the website pim.cgir.org under the tag of resources. And today's seminar will also be posted there shortly after. Today's topic is Community Forest Concessions in Petén, Guatemala, Effective Governance for Tropical Forest Conservation and Socioeconomic Development. This work is undertaken by PIM as part of our Governance of Natural Resources flagship. I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers today. The first is Dietmar Stoian. He's a senior scientist in value chains and private sector engagement, working with Bioversity International's Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems Initiative and the Productive and Resilient Farms, Forests, and Landscapes Initiative of Bioversity. Integrating value chain and livelihood approaches, Dietmar's research identifies opportunities for smallholder households and their business organizations, such as cooperatives, associations, limited liability enterprises, to enhance livelihood, resilience, and business viability. And Dietmar's work on private sector engagement focuses on involving large agri-food companies and business models based on environmental and social responsibility, aiming to achieve food and nutrition security among low-income households in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Our second speaker today is Iliana Monterroso. She's an environmental scientist, and she's recently completed her postdoc fellowship with CIFOR, the Center for Forestry Research, based in Indonesia, and she continues collaborating as a research consultant. Since 2014, she has coordinated research activities of the Global Comparative Study on Design and Implementation on Tenure Reforms in Peru and Colombia, where she led the analysis of outcomes from land and forest right recognition processes in the Amazon. She has done extensive research in Central America around territorial rights, community forestry, and reform processes. She holds a PhD in environmental sciences from the autonomous Barcelona University in Spain, and her research focuses on collective tenure, gender, and socio-environmental conflicts in Latin America. Now, before I hand this over to Dietmar and Iliana, I would like to explain how we will proceed today. So our speakers will begin very shortly with the presentation that you will see on your screens. The presentation will last for about 30-35 minutes. During the presentation, we invite you all to send in questions via the chat and question windows on the right side of your screen. We will collate the questions and group any that are similar in content. And once we are in the Q&A session, our speakers will address the questions that I'll pose myself, building on yours. And we are handling the questions this way to make the best use of our 1 hour together. And as I mentioned before, we are recording the webinar and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event for those unable to join us now or who would like a replay. So with that brief introduction, let me hand it over first to Dietmar.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Frank, and thanks to everyone for listening. As Frank already alluded to, this work has been funded by the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, and we are very grateful for this support. The work as such has been carried out in collaboration between Bioversity International, CIFOR, and the Rainforest Alliance, and various local organizations. We also would like to acknowledge the contributions of Aldo Rodas, who you see here as a co-author of the study, who unfortunately cannot be with us for the presentation. He was leading the local data collection team on the ground. The Petén in Guatemala is an area where there is the Maya Biosphere Reserve, and the Maya Biosphere Reserve has an extension of 2.1 million hectares, so roughly 5 million acres. And as such, it is the largest protected area in Central America. And in a way, you see very nicely summarized the problems that are affecting the Maya Biosphere Reserve in this newspaper article that appeared in a local newspaper in August, which in a way translates like there is progressively less biosphere reserve. And you see it a bit on the photo. There's some deforestation eating into parts of the reserve. And this is part of the conflicts that we see. There are tenure conflicts, there's land use change going on, but there is also community stewardship. And as we want to make the case, actually under community stewardships, those portions of the reserve that are managed by communities, you see by far the best results in terms of forest conservation and socioeconomic development. The objectives of the study were, in general terms, to identify the socioeconomic benefits of community forestry as they are perceived by the members of community forest enterprises that manage these concessions. And then we had 3 specific objectives. 1, to identify the conditions that enable or disable forest management in the community forest concessions, and also the associated value adding. Then to assess the socioeconomic performance of community forest enterprises. And finally, to document the household livelihood strategies of the members of these enterprises, and to determine the absolute and the relative weight of forest activities within these livelihoods. Sorry, in terms of the methodology, we were using for an original study, and you're going to see it on another slide, there was a sequence of different studies that we carried out over the last 3 to 4 years. The original studies were carried out with an adapted methodology based on 5 capitals that a colleague of mine and I developed when we were still working out of Costa Rica a couple of years ago. You know 5 capitals also as the different livelihoods framework, focusing on human, social, natural, financial, and physical capitals. More recently, we have been developing a gender responsive version of that methodology, which is going to come out anytime soon, and it's called 5 capitals G. And we had already actually some baseline data that go back to 2009. Today, we don't present these, but we could compare a first set of 3 concessions with more recent 2013 data collected with 5 capitals, with the former baseline data. And then more recently, and this is where we were partnering with the Rainforest Alliance, we were able to mobilize additional funds, and with that, we could study the remaining 6 active concessions, and more recently also 3 inactive concessions. When you add up the math here, we talk about 12 community concessions. All of these had, when they were all operating or when they still are active, still have a community forest enterprise that runs the concession. So as part of the enterprise assessment, we did a census of the 12 community forest enterprises. Before we actually went there, we did the context analysis. There we did about 35 key informant interviews that were representatives of government agencies, NGOs, private sector. We also fed back some of the preliminary results to them in focus group discussions. And finally, once we had done the enterprise assessment, we went down to the household level with the general goal to have.
Okay, so as you can see, Dietmar was referring to the methodology. I'm going to start, well, just walking through the study area. So this study took place, as Dietmar mentioned, since 2009 on 12 community concessions in the multiple use zone in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. This would be the light green perimeters that you would see, which encompass about 400,000 hectares in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. And they refer to 25-year contracts between the Guatemalan government and community-based organizations.
Okay, so we can go on here with showing how then the setup was done over the last year. So we started with 3 concessions that we had investigated already earlier on, the first time in 2009, then we could have comparative data in 2013. And then we went on for another 3 concessions more in the eastern part of the multiple use zone. Then Rainforest Alliance came on board and provided some funds to study the remaining 3 active concessions. And finally, and this is work only done this year, these are the 3 concessions that are inactive. And you see it already here on the map. I mean, all the green part here is pretty much intact forest cover. And I guess Iliana was alluding to the fact that in the active concessions, we talk about an annual deforestation rate of just 0.1%. as opposed to 1.8% in the inactive concessions. So there was some land use change in the past for a variety of reasons. We come back to that a bit later. But it's interesting to compare then the deforestation rate of 1.8% in the inactive concessions with the deforestation rate in the national park, which is 1.0%. But there are other areas in the multiple use zone that are not assigned as of today as concessions. This is where we have 2.2% deforestation rate. And the highest rate actually we have down here in the buffer zone, where it is 5.5%. So you see the summary of the 12 concessions that have been studied. And this is in a way the sequence from 2006, where we did some first work actually already in 2 concessions. Later on with the original version of 5 capitals, the first set of 3 concessions with 90 interviews. We did a follow-up study then when I was already working for Bioversity, again with 5 capitals in the same 3 concessions. This is where we were flipping over, if you will, to 5 capitals G, the gender responsive version. And then finally, we did an adapted version of that in the 3 inactive concessions. So starting with the results, in this case with the first phase, which is context analysis. What you do see here is kind of a traffic light table where we compare the situation at the onset of the concessions with the current day situation. What you do see in red are conditions, enabling conditions or disabling conditions, where we think altogether these are ineffective, certain aspects are unavailable, they are underdeveloped, they are dysfunctional. Green would stand for something that is effective, that is readily available, that is advanced, that is well developed or highly functional, and the yellow stands somewhere in between. So I think what you can observe at the first glance is that what was largely disabling about 20 years ago is now largely either enabling or at least on the way to be enabling. So altogether, when we see all these different institutional factors, we see clear progress. There's one aspect that still is kind of in red. That is important to mention, because here we talk about both internal and external governance structures that would allow to mitigate external threats that come from outside of the multiple use zone. And that could be wildfires that might extend then into the multiple use zone. That could be the expansion of cattle ranching. You saw a photo on one of the first slides. And it could also be certain illicit activities, reminding you that we are in the border area with Mexico. So there is actually quite some drug trafficking going on that goes into Mexico and from there on to the US. So in these conditions, we don't really see any kind of improvement. But we do see improvement is a couple of other aspects that have to do with tenure security. Here we distinguish between de facto and de jure tenure security. We didn't put that all together in green because the concessions have been granted for 25 years, and the first concession cycle will be up over the next few years. And right now there are quite some disputes over that. And for that reason, communities are still kind of insecure whether they will be granted a second concession cycle. And that's why we put that here into yellow. But at the same time, we can definitely see very positive evolution of the sense of ownership in terms of the forest resources. There is definitely a much more enabling political, legal and institutional support environment from the government. There are guidelines for managing timber and non-timber forest products based on technical criteria. There is access to forest certification under the Forest Stewardship Council. There's nowadays science-based evidence that timber management is sustainable. And this list goes on. It also has to do with the kind of support that comes from NGOs and projects, has to do also with better access to working capital. So here you see another picture actually of the deforestation trends. and the data that go into this map have been gathered between 2000 and 2013. That is third-party data. You see the buffer zone largely deforested. Even in the national park, quite some deforestation. And then only in the multiple use. So here we see the results of the enterprise assessment. And there you see in general terms a positive trend of membership in the 9 active concessions, where we talk about a 26% increase of members between 2000 and 2017. And the inactive concessions with their enterprises, they ceased to operate between 2007 and 2009. So here you see the percentage of the female membership over time. And you see that usually the average is not much more than 20 to 30%, but in some of the enterprises, actually, there has been an upward trend over the last years. In some of those cases, because there has been a particular policy put in place to encourage the membership of women. There was also a question in our survey where we asked the women and the men whether they think there are equal opportunities for men and women to join those enterprises. In general terms, men and women do think that there are same opportunities, whereas there are certain women definitely who think that some men are preferred. Altogether, a relative similar picture when we ask both men and women. In terms of employment in the community forest enterprises, you see on the right-hand side here the situation 5 years ago as compared to the present-day information situation. And here, when we zoom in terms of part-time opportunities for women to work, you see that over the last 5 years, there has been a clear improvement. And that is particularly also true for the women. On this slide, which is a bit complex, let me draw your attention first to the left-hand side. Here we show the progress in terms of administration and management capacities in the community forest enterprises from the very start of those enterprises in 1994 till the present day. The first 3 columns here refer to the inactive concessions. So they operated only for a few number of years, and as of 2006, they went out of operation. In the other cases, the 9 active concessions, most of them actually started only around 2000. And then you see a progressive move from not having actually any kind of manager. This stands for the 10 color here, moving on to the yellow color, which signals there was a manager then appointed, even though that person didn't have any formal training. And finally, in many cases, moving on to green, where there is a manager with formal training. With an asterisk, you would have those cases where the manager has been recruited from outside of the community forest enterprise. So you see that by and large, at least for these 9 active community forest enterprises, there is now semi-professional or professional management in place. So a similar trend can be observed over time in terms of the value adding capacity in the enterprises. And that starts actually where the timber, when we talk about wood processing, was first of all sold as standing trees. Later on, there was some progress towards roundwood sales, then community enterprises started to rent a sawmill, and more recently, they bought their own sawmill. So you see also here progression. These 3, again, are the inactive ones, but all the active ones are actually progressing towards having their own sawmill. By the time we did the survey, 8 out of the 9 active were operating an own sawmill, and more recently it is even the 9th one that has also purchased one. So a clear professionalization and more value-adding processing that can be observed. Here we provide data on timber extraction and also mahogany. Mahogany is definitely the species that yields most of the income. That's why it is quite interesting to do these kind of comparisons. You see the 12 different community forest enterprises and the overall volume they have extracted over the past, say, 15 to 18 years. So there is one that stands out here that has relatively higher volumes, but then most of the others actually have relatively modest volumes. Here we refer to cubic meters extracted per member. So you can also see that those kind of enterprises here, Suchitecos is actually the one that only has 20 members. So then the volume extracted per member is of course necessarily higher. And that later on is also reflected in some of the economic and financial data that we present. When you simply make the comparison between the volume extracted in terms of cubic meter per hectare of the intervened area, you see it is relatively more equal across the concessions. That also then translates into financial capital. These are the figures of timber sales over the years 2012 to 2016. This is the cumulative income in terms of quetzales. Roughly, you can convert 7 quetzales into $1. And you see here that certain enterprises have gotten up to 35 million quetzales, which would translate into roughly 5 million, maybe $4 million here. This is a breakdown per year. Altogether, we can say that over those 5 years, an overall gross income has been generated that is equivalent to $25 million US. That in turn has been used by many enterprises to invest in physical assets. And physical assets can be anything like processing facilities, equipment, machinery, other types of infrastructure. And there again is quite a variation across the different types of enterprises, the physical assets they have. Just calling your attention to one of those enterprises where actually some reinvestment has taken place into farms that are managed outside of the multiple use zone in the buffer zone. So they're also diversifying their production, in this case with cattle ranching. This is the wood value chain in which the 9 active community forestry enterprises are involved. You see again the cumulative figures here for 2012 to 2016. More than 90% of the timber actually goes into export. You see the different species. Most important one is mahogany here. Annual timber sales worth roughly $4.4 million in the export chain, and roughly another $500,000 is then generated in the domestic market, which is again the same type of species, but usually the lower qualities. Important to note that 74% of the gross income is derived from one species, and that is mahogany. There's quite a high dependence on that species. Here, a quick illustration how value adding and asset building actually takes place. In the conventional channel for mahogany that goes into medium end type of furniture, about $4 to $5 per board feet of mahogany can be generated. But recently, some of the enterprises have opened up an alternative channel, and that is a special type of mahogany with a special pattern that goes into the production of guitars. And these guitars are high-value guitars, no doubt about it. Very famous rock stars actually playing Gibson, Taylor guitars, and others. And this is where the price that the community forestry enterprises can fetch is 5 times or more as high as in the conventional channel. And that you then can see translated into other physical assets. That is an office building of the enterprise where this gentleman is working. The very first one in 2001, of course, it wasn't as rotten as it looks nowadays, but it shows you how small it was. 2009, already bigger one, and that is now the new building that is right next to the other building. So you see there's a positive feedback loop. New income that is generated is reinvested in the enterprise. And I would like to finalize the presentation of results at the enterprise level with a focus on shutter palm. That is a palm that is used for floral arrangements. That also goes largely into export. The activity is largely a male activity when it is about extracting the product in the forest under very simple and rudimentary conditions. But then when it's about grading and preparing the palm fronds for export, this is where there's a lot of women involvement. And I think that is important because we're going to see that at the household level data later on. Altogether, I think just to give you a figure, almost 500,000 palm fronds have been extracted over the last years. And there's also clear indication that this extraction is sustainable. With that, I would like to pass on the microphone to Iliana.
Thank you, Dietmar. So I will try to continue really quick to advance on this. So at the household level, data was collated for 292 households with interviews to both men and women members of community forest enterprises in active concessions and 2 inactive concessions. Considering time constraints, this slide will mainly present results at the family level, focusing on financial and physical capital and reinvestments in human and social capital. So income, as you will see in this graph, income from forest-related activities, mainly timber and non-timber forest extraction, represent in average 38% of total household income. This graph reviews the average composition of income household sources, showing that the 2 most important sources among members from 11 community forest enterprises are forest income and followed by other income sources, mainly employment. Important to note here is that the contributions, as you will see in remittances and agriculture and cattle ranching, are insignificant. And what we can see here is that results highlight differences across and within the different community forest enterprises. So forest income contribution in nine active community forest enterprises varies and contributes between 11% up to 63% of household income, with additional sources including PD commerce, agriculture, although not as significant in some. So following to the next slide, here we show the most important income sources, including income coming from the community forest enterprise, obtained either through employment, and for those community forest enterprises who have the legal figure that allows it, dividends. The green bar that Dietmar is showing right now highlights that indeed income coming from forest enterprises is among the most important sources in the household. The graph below shows that the type of physical capital accrued by family members, including mainly household appliances, technology, land, and motorcycles. Financial capital, this is forest income derived from employment and dividends, is invested either in savings and debt pay. Distribution of dividends, as we argued previously, is limited to those that have the legal figure that allows it, which means only 5 of 9 active concessions. And here you will see how these households distribute the income they receive into either savings and debts. This next slide shows that probably one of the most important results at the family level is coming from the analysis of how households reinvest forest income in human, social, and physical capital. Here we show improvements in human capital mainly refer to improved access to education, whereas developments in social capital are linked directly to the process of mobilization and organization to access community forest concessions, but also the development of these communities' enterprises, with an interesting increase, as Dietmar mentioned, in membership of both men and women over the last years. This graph shows how households reinvest mostly in household improvements, health and education, highlighting positive outcomes in the livelihoods of household members, differentiating again by income from employment versus dividends. Okay, so this is, and this last slide at the family level is showing the extent to how women and men make decisions within the household. And what you will see in these two graphs is the comparison of two different community forest enterprises and how they make decisions within the household. So you will see on the left side in the community forest enterprise that is being Árbol Verde versus the other one, Suchitecos, you will see a more equitable decision-making process where you will see that decisions are made by both members, both men and women members within the household, versus these other community forest enterprises where you can evidently see that the decisions are taken mainly by men. And these are decisions over how, the income from forests, from community forest enterprises is used to define which household assets or how to reinvest the incomes from the community forest enterprise. So now we're going to talk about what happened with inactive concessions. So as Dietmar mentioned, between 2006 and 2008, reduced availability of commercial valuable timber species hindered income generation in 3 community forest enterprises. Combined with reduced external support, these factors weakened the internal governance structures and led to illegal land sales, mainly to cattle ranchers within 3 concessions areas. This led to the suspension of FSC certification and later cancellation of 2 of these community forest enterprises and the suspension of the management plan in the 3rd one. These 3 community forest enterprises remain inactive today. So in 2009, illegal forest fire affected over 800 hectares of forest, which brought about a strong condemnation from different sectors and resulted in the mobilization of Guatemala government authorities to evict illegal settlers as an effort to recover the governance of these areas. This research team made the first effort to calculate the costs, which are shown in this slide, associated with these actions, showing that the accumulated cost amount over $1.5 million of US dollars, which refers mainly to eviction and cost for building a control post to avoid further settlements. The cost of keeping the operation of this control post represents about $200,000 annually. Although the costs are distributed among different government entities, the National Council of Protected Area reports that the cost of this post alone represents about 1/3 of their annual budget. If we go to the next, thank you. And this is for comparison, financial contributions for this, the National Protected Area Council from 12 community forest enterprises, including 3 currently inactive community enterprises, have amounted about $2 million over the period 1994 to 2008. So this means that mainly all the income that is coming from these community forest enterprises into this government entity is being spent to make sure to safeguard the concession area, this one concession area. So this timely action, what you will see in the table above, is that this timely action from the government allowed that the forest loss in this concession area was not only controlled, but as you will see in the case of what happened in the concession area of La Colorada, which is the first, which is shown right now, actually is showing a slight level of recuperation in the area where there was direct intervention, but of course at a very high cost. And in the other 2 concession areas where no direct intervention has occurred, community members and outsiders remain with limited constraints to access forest resources, as managed activities have been suspended in one and the contract has been canceled in another. And as a result, forest loss continues to increase. And what you will see here in the graph below is the number of fire incidents between 2001 and 2017. The red one is the illegal fire that I was talking about earlier. So what happened in these 2 areas that were suspended and canceled, and this refers to the other cancel concession that was not evicted, this has impacted considerably the livelihoods of those families still living within the concession area, especially as, and here the graph shows the variation of income sources today, during and prior to community enterprises operations. And you will see that prior and during the concession was still active, the role that forest extraction, especially non-timber forest products, had for the income of these households, and how this has affected the number of activities that communities need to engage now. Mainly right now, the main source of income is agriculture. And this has actually increased poverty conditions for families living there. So and this is a similar analysis analyzing how right now the main income source activities are agriculture, but other activities which are definitely not related to forest activities, as these are no longer allowed in the concession areas. And I think this is where I stop, and I pass again to Dietmar.
Okay, thank you, Iliana. So wrapping up the main findings, let's start with the 9 active community forest enterprises. They occupy 350,000 hectares roughly, and that is important because in terms of the sheer numbers, you might say, well, 9 are active, 3 are inactive. That doesn't sound so good. But after all, they managed. The 9 active was much more area of forest. And that is actually one of the reasons why it works there as opposed to the inactive ones. So here we talk about 350,000 hectares, which is equivalent to almost half of the area in the multiple use zone. The deforestation rate, as we said before, is very, very low, 0.1%, so almost negligible. We saw the membership growth there of 26% over the last 17 years. Roughly 2/3 of the members are male, roughly 1/3 is female. On the boards of these community forest enterprises, it's a bit more distorted. We have almost 80% male members and 20% female, but this share is really going up quite rapidly. Just a few years ago, it was almost 0 here and 100% male. The value of the physical assets translated into dollars, roughly $6 million US. The total volume extracted, and I would like to focus actually on this figure. If we go about by those kind of areas that have been effectively intervened, we talk about over more or less a 20-year period of just 1.8 cubic meter per hectare. And those of you who are not foresters, and hopefully the foresters among you would agree with me that as a rule of thumb, in a tropical forest environment, you can roughly extract 1 cubic meter per year and hectare in a sustainable fashion. So here they have extracted 2, but over a 20-year period. So if you break that down by year, you get down to 0.1%, and it is roughly only 10% of what probably the forest could produce. So very, very conservative extraction rates. Important, as we said before, is the role of mahogany, 50% of the total volume, but almost 3/4 of the total value generated by mahogany. And then the non-timber forest product sales amounting to a bit more than $3 million US. If you go to the 3 inactive ones, there we have a combined area of less than 50,000 hectares. This is 6% of the multiple use zone, but a much higher deforestation rate, as just Iliana was alluding to. And that was actually also the reason why the concession contracts have been cancelled in 2 cases and the management plan suspended in another case. And actually, we do think that one of the reasons, it's a bit more complex, but one of the reasons why actually these concessions failed is that at the very onset of the concession contract, they had a pretty low availability of high-value timber species, and particularly mahogany. So from the very beginning, they were put somewhat at disadvantage. And even in the years before they were seeding the operation, they had already a decrease in membership. So there weren't sufficient benefits perceived by them, so already membership went down by 10%. Here you see also, this is interesting when you compare it again with the figure that we just saw on the other slide. So somewhat higher extraction rates, still way below what you would consider as a threshold for sustainability. But you can say that they try to compensate the lack of mahogany through higher volumes of lesser known species. And you see here that as opposed to the active concessions where 50% of the volume was contributed by mahogany, here it was less than 30%. At the household level, we can definitely talk about a strong diversification of livelihoods. They vary across the enterprises, but also within. The membership in the enterprises, as we said, is mainly male, but we saw relatively more gender equity in terms of decision making, but again with quite some wide variation. In the active CFEs, the forest income that is still available contributes 38% to household total income. And really important, and that stands out when you compare it with other parts of Guatemala. So there is hardly any out-migration, and this is why remittances also don't really play any important role. And that is, I think, an important message, because forest-based income in this case can help people to establish sustainable livelihoods, and that is actually then a good reason to keep these forests under community stewardship. The absolute value that is generated as forest income varies quite a bit. In some cases, it's as low as $500 per year and household. In other cases, Suchitecos, you have heard the name before, it can go up to $10,000. So on average, people move definitely above the poverty line, sometimes with forest-based income alone, sometimes in combination with other income sources. And I think you saw it also on the slides that the households do reinvest. Those where there is less income available, they reinvest in basic needs. But where these are already met, they also do investments in improved housing, education, and physical assets. Our team who revisited the San Miguel concession was really impressed by the high level of poverty that they found. And this is exactly the case in these 2 inactive concessions where there is still a resident population, where people simply are deprived of the forest-based income and they haven't been able to generate sufficient alternative income. That gets us to the conclusions. We do observe, particularly in the active concessions, positive feedback loops in terms of asset building. There is a generation of financial capital, and that in turn leads to the generation of physical capital, more natural capital, also human and social capital. In addition to actually the membership that is benefiting, there are also positive spillover effects to the local communities, because some of them can also be employed even without being a member. There are certain goods and services that are procured from the communities, and there are certain investments also in overall community development. At the same time, we see as kind of a warning example the inactive concessions. There we do think that there weren't minimum requirements met at the very beginning, and these would include have sufficient resource endowments. There should also be livelihoods fit. Several households in those inactive concessions actually came with a much stronger agricultural background, and they had a harder time to switch into a more forest activity type of livelihood. And finally, also the organization institutional strength needs to have a minimum level in order to operate successfully. The weak governance that you observe, particularly outside of the multiple use zone, and particularly in the core zone and the buffer zones, is really a threat for the reserve as a whole, and with a very high risk of deforestation and actually also outright violence. But altogether, ending on a positive note here, because of the successful example of the active community forest enterprises and concessions, we can say that this type of community stewardship is a strong model for the combined effects of forest conservation and livelihoods development, and that actually allows for a strong case for the communities to renew the concessions. Here I have summarized some of the publications that have been already coming out and some more that are coming up. We had already launching events recently with Iliana and Aldo Rodas and others in the Petén in Guatemala City. We plan for one more in Washington around the World Bank Conference on Land and Poverty in March next year. And finally, we would also like to point at the political economy that surrounds the concessions. There is a case here where the very Minister of Agriculture right now is involved in a case where he wants to monopolize the shutter trade. You remember the palm fronds that are extracted by the community forest enterprises. That has been really discussed quite heavily criticized, particularly by NGOs. Recently, also a public statement of the National Council for Protected Areas that says they consider the communities really as their allies, and they ask very clearly that others, and that refers very clearly here to the minister, would not really try to intervene in an inappropriate way. So that gets us to the final part of it. We're looking into the future. We do think that there is continued stakeholder engagement needed in order to support the community in their claim to extend the concession contracts. So this is why we want to study more clearly the political economy that surrounds the concession process. We also would like to understand better how the governance works or doesn't work in the other parts of the Maya Biosphere Reserve, particularly in the core and the buffer zones. And I think we want to drill a bit deeper in terms of opportunities, future perspectives for women and the youth. With that, I would like to thank for your attention and hand over the mic back to IFPRI.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Dietmar and Iliana. We received some questions, and I had a couple myself, so I'll get to it. So we have about 15 more minutes. One question I had, just if you could maybe on setting the context a bit better, is this the only reserve where there's some concessions in Guatemala and community forest enterprises? Are there others, and is there research going on in the other ones? And what are they and if so, what are they finding in the other ones as well?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Frank. Actually, since this is a biosphere reserve, it is quite particular because of typical 3 different zones. I think what stands out is here that in the multiple use zone, they have actually issued the concessions. To put that into context, it's actually the one and only place in the world where concessions have been particularly issued to communities. Usually in most of the tropical forest areas we are working in and are knowledgeable of, you have industrial concessions. So that is a particularly mode. Of course, there are other ways of doing community forestry and of granting usufruct rights to communities. So in that sense, some of the data are comparable. I think, and I'm not sure whether Steve is also listening. His team have been doing also, Iliana, involved some studies in other countries like Nepal. So I think at the community forest enterprise level, some of the data are comparable. But based on my knowledge and insight of a couple of countries where community forestry is taking place, Guatemala is leading in terms of the evolution of these community forest enterprises, in terms of the benefits generated.
Okay, great. So we had a couple of questions around the membership and benefits and sharing of those benefits. So maybe can you explain a bit first how one becomes a member in one of these CFEs, and what the kind of the proportion of the overall population is in the area that belong? We could see some numbers of a few thousands, I think, on your graphs.
Yeah, maybe I can start and maybe Iliana then chimes in. So altogether, we have a bit more than 1,100 members right now. It's important to differentiate between resident and non-resident communities. I feel we haven't explained that more in detail in the very beginning. Those concessions have a long-standing history in forest product extraction, particularly chewing gum, chicle, and in some other non-timber forest product that goes back 100 or more years. So they were there before the reserve was actually established, and their rights have been recognized. But then there are other parts, particularly in the eastern part of the reserve, where actually you have small towns. And from there, traditionally, people went into the forest to do logging. It was considered illegal because they didn't really have the official rights to do so. So in those cases, those groups gathered, and they then together applied for a concession. And this is one of the reasons why the membership varies quite a bit. So in the lowest case, we have 20. The highest case, we have 350. And in all those resident communities, most of the people are members, not everyone. But maybe Iliana, you want to add to that?
Well, I would just add that it's important to note that here we're talking about a protected area. So the idea is not necessarily to have a lot of people living or settle within this multiple use zone, because only those communities that existed before the establishment of the protected area were allowed to remain. Others had to do other type of arrangements or get out. So this kind of raises a different question, as if you would have in other areas where the property rights are within the people, and then you would have a higher number of people that you would like to involve. So here, the challenge has been how to broaden the benefits outside, being not only member of the organization, because the organization is linked to the management of the forest, but also to develop other sources of benefits that go even beyond the membership base.
Right. Great. So you had mentioned in the seminar that there was, you mentioned that the proportion of women members has gone up, and you referred to a policy that might have had an impact. Can you explain what the policy is about and what it did?
Yeah, well, that's in one particular case, actually, Arbol Verde. You might remember where we built up also, and that's interesting. You saw that at the household level, there's relatively much more equitable decision making, and this kind of spirit, if you will, also has translated now, penetrated into the very management of the enterprise. And all of the more recent new members, I think over the last 5 years or so, were virtually exclusively women. And this is where the men rightfully say they think there's preference given to women, but that's a more recent evolution.
Okay.
And if you allow me just to add, most of the changes were done at the bylaws of these organizations.
That's what I was, okay. So it was at that level.
It's not a national policy, but at the local level, where the organizations themselves decide to make this change.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you. Then, so a question came in about the sharing of benefits, because in some, it's observed elsewhere for sure that there's a lead capture when there's some of these kinds of collective or communal arrangements. And so I was wondering, the question was, is there did you have evidence that the benefits are shared amongst the poor and the wealthy kind of in an equitable way? And if so, how is, what rules or bylaws make sure that happens? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a complex question. Again, Iliana, you might help me then when I'm missing something. I think first of all, you have to make a distinction between the enterprises that are allowed to pay dividends, those that are not. So the so-called civil societies can do that, and that is one dividend, the same amount per member. So once you're a member, you get it.
Okay.
There's also enterprises that allow for more than one member per household. So that depends on up to how many really, if want to apply, and they do that quite often actually in those cases where dividend payments are available. Then there is a question who can get the employment, and we don't really talk about permanent employment. I mean, the logging operations are taking place over about 3 to 4 months, the processing maybe 2 to 3 months, similar periods or seasons for non-timber forest product extraction. There might be certain effects where certain families have a bit more access than others, but we didn't find very outright reflection of elite capturing. Some people do criticize, though, those kind of civil societies that have a very reduced membership. And Suchitecos, you've heard the name several times, is one of those examples. They have membership that is actually decreasing, and this is why you get up to $10,000 per member per year as forest-based income. Some people do criticize these people, but I'm not sure whether you could call it elite capturing, because who else would be then the members? Because this is a non-resident community, so then there are around them, what is it? The owner of the gas station, the lady who works in the restaurant, a dentist, a lawyer around the corner. Is there a point to allow them to be members to get access to that? So that becomes a bit more a complex discussion. Iliana, maybe you can add to that?
Yes, I think that these results are not also another issue that we're not highlighting here is those investments at the village level or at the local level outside of the non-members. So you have a lot of these community forest enterprises that invest at the village level in health, like paying also in education, paying for teachers, investing in infrastructure, in road infrastructure, keeping the roads. So these are villages, especially for those that are residents that are living very far away from the towns. So most of the activities of social investments are actually covering for what the local government is not doing. And this would also apply in the areas like Dietmar was saying, where their membership base is very limited, but still there are investments that go beyond the membership base and outside the community forest enterprises, but mainly at the village or local level. Health, mainly health, education, and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Great. So a couple questions came in about so this is the governance of these concessions. So one was asking whether there's external pressures, corruption, illegal activities, and so forth that threaten the governance, the sound governance of these concessions. And another related one was kind of the role of NGOs to help shape or provide or support institutional reforms and towards better governance of their concessions.
Yeah, NGO is definitely playing a very, very strong role. And here I could highlight the role, just as one example, of Rainforest Alliance. I mean, altogether, NGOs projects have been supporting the reserve as a whole, not only the multiple use zone, with projects worth more than $150 million over the last 20 years. So massive support, mainly USAID funded. Rainforest has been looking quite a bit into governance issues. They were actually those who added some questions on governance to our questionnaire. So yes, they have been working on that. Trouble is a little bit that CONAP is understaffed as the national authority in charge of the protected areas. Mm-hmm. So they can't really fulfill their functions for the multiple use zone, but it's really tough for them to also have as much influence on the core zone, particularly also on the buffer zone. And this is where the governance is much, much weaker. Mm-hmm. And this is also one of the reasons why we would like to look a bit more into that. In terms also of influencing the whole process, I mean, the NGOs are also helping the communities to get this kind of information that they can use to substantiate their claim for concession renewal. And they also sometimes make public if there are certain interferences, like the one from the current minister who wants to monopolize shutter trade. Iliana, you definitely have to add something to that as well, don't you?
Yeah, I would just finish saying that, you know, another type of investment that is really important for these community forest enterprises is how much they actually invest in protecting their exclusion rights against outsiders, and also, you know, the supporting control activities because of the government being understaffed. And they actually invest, according to the data that we have from the Community Forest Association, that over $500,000 per year from these 9 active concessions are going into covering for keeping staff in control posts, making sure that areas are protected from fires to extend. So this is very important because indeed there are a lot of external pressures affecting, and they are very varied. They can even be, you know, like illegal fires to even expansion of narco traffic. So that, yeah, indeed, these areas, as Dietmar mentioned, are subject to pressures, constant pressures from different interests in the areas.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We had a question that came in as how much is being reinvested in reforestation? I guess both in these concession areas and maybe talk about the buffer zone areas also that look like are heavily deforested at the moment.
That's a great question. Actually, I would say for the active concession, there isn't really a need for that because you've seen a deforestation rate is 1% per year. And you may argue the kind of openings there are so small, there's actually a pretty active process of natural regeneration.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
In active concessions, there is definitely a need, but I fear the 2 resident communities there don't have the means. That is definitely an area of possible intervention also to rehabilitate the kind of deforested area, to provide them through rehabilitation new income opportunities. We're discussing that with CONAP and others, but it has yet to happen. Buffer zone, completely agreed. We actually try to encourage some of the community forestry enterprises to have a second leg, and the second leg would be in the buffer zone based maybe on timber plantations. This way they could actually make much better use of the installed capacities in their sawmills. They could do reforestation with all the spillover effects, etc. But it's not really happening. We would hope that we can provide some evidence that this is the right way to go.
Great. So maybe I'll just conclude with one question. There was a question that came in just to give some final words on what you thought the main challenges were to sustainable forest management in the Petén area. The reserve, and then maybe related to that, what are the you mentioned that they're all coming up for review, these concessions after 25 years, and so what are the current debates and prospects for renewal and possibly expansion of these in other areas around the reserve?
That's a very contested area right now. It's also quite clear that the current government, which has a bit more than a year still to go, will probably not do anything to move ahead with that. And that then also affects CONAP as the very authority who is in charge of that. I mean, we are constantly in touch with them. The kind of launching events we had were involving them, but because of this, let me call it shutter business of the minister, they said in the public events they didn't want to have a high profile, but they invited us over for a private presentation, if you will, where they had 13 altogether mid and a few high-level managers listening over 3 hours and discussing with us the findings. I think in this statement that they have, and that is pulled up on the slide that you still see, they very clearly show that altogether they are sympathetic with the communities. They are convinced that altogether in the active concessions they are doing a good job. But of course, there will be political pressure under the next government, and there are different claims on that. Some people want to lock it off. just do tourism development around the Maya temples that are being excavated. Others would like to see more cattle ranching. Others might even want to put some oil palm plantation into that. It's quite convoluted. So at this moment, it's difficult to say. I think our report, in addition to existing reports that show the very low deforestation in the active concessions, provides scientific evidence that also from a socioeconomic perspective, the concessions are performing very well. And this is why definitely the communities, but also CONOP, appreciate this kind of study, because it helps them later on to do their deliberations. But it's a contested field. Iliana, do you want to add to that?
I would just add two little things. One is, well, next year, it's a key year for us because we will have national elections. And also, according to the national regulations, it's the year when, according to the concession regulations, the government needs to establish the guidelines for renewal. So it will be very key and up to the decision of these new government authorities. And in terms of perspectives on this model itself, I think that regarding sustainable development, the concession model has proved that it's complying with the goals that it was created, which was mainly keeping the forest cover. But also, I think that there are a lot of lessons coming out from how this model has influenced and provided lessons learned to other countries. For instance, in Colombia, just at the end of December, they just issued a national policy on community forestry, which is drawing mainly from this case. And there were a lot of government authorities from the Colombian government in Petén kind of learning about the process. So I think that this will be useful for us to keep the processes informed with scientific evidence as this type of research, but also, in terms of pressure of making sure that the government is aware and will comply with, all of the successes that the process has had, despite the challenges, of course.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Dietmar and Iliana. It's a very important topic, as you've noted, and I think there's kind of a dearth of data around some of these issues and how alternative mechanisms for governing are performing, and so this is a very, very much needed types of research and information. So I thank you again very much, and thanks to everybody who joined us online and for your questions. And just one more marketing plug. We'll have another PIM webinar on the 19th of December. So stay tuned and check your emails for the invite. So thanks once again.